The summer of 1882 in New Mexico territory was brutal, the kind of heat that made grown men question their decision to settle in such unforgiving land. Samuel Chen had been living alone on his small piece of property for 2 years now, ever since his wife passed away. The days were long, the nights were lonely, and most of the time, the only company he had was the sound of the wind whistling through the canyon nearby. That particular evening in August, Samuel was finishing up his daily chores. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, when he heard a strange sound near his water pump. At first he thought it might be a coyote or maybe a wild dog, but something about the noise made him grab his lantern and walk over to check. What he found made his heart skip a beat. There, collapsed on the ground near his water pump, was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her skin was covered in cuts and bruises, and she looked like she hadn't eaten in days, maybe even weeks. Samuel could see her ribs through her thin clothing, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. He knew immediately she was Apache. The tensions between settlers and the Apache people had been running high for years. There had been raids, conflicts, and a lot of bloodshed on both sides. Most of his neighbors would have turned her away without a second thought. Some might have even done worse. But Samuel wasn't most people. He knelt down beside the girl and spoke softly, even though he wasn't sure she could understand English. Her eyes opened slightly and he could see the fear in them. She tried to move away from him, but she was too weak. Samuel held up his hands to show he meant no harm and carefully scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. Inside his small cabin, Samuel laid her down on his only couch. He went to the kitchen and got some water, but he knew he had to be careful. Giving too much water too fast to someone who'd been starving could make them sick. He'd seen it happen before, so he let her take just small sips, waiting between each one, watching her carefully. The girl drank like someone who hadn't seen water in forever. After a few minutes, when he was sure she could handle it, Samuel went to prepare some food. Nothing fancy, just some cornbread and beans, simple food that would be easy on her stomach. While the food was warming up, he noticed something that made his chest tighten with anger and sadness. There were rope burns on her wrists, fresh ones. Someone had tied her up, and recently. When he brought the food to her, the girl's eyes went wide. She looked at the plate, then at him, then back at the plate as if she couldn't believe it was real. Samuel nodded and made eating motions with his hand. She didn't need to be told twice. She ate so fast that Samuel worried she might choke. He had to gently slow her down, showing her with his hands to take it easy. The whole time she didn't say a single word, not one. She just watched him with those big, frightened eyes like a trapped animal waiting to see if the cage would open or close tighter. Samuel understood that fear. He'd seen it in the eyes of wounded soldiers during his time in the war years ago. It was the look of someone who'd been hurt so badly that trust seemed impossible. After she finished eating, Samuel could see exhaustion taking over her small body. He prepared the spare room for her, the one that used to be meant for the child he and his wife never got to have. He put clean sheets on the bed and left a pitcher of water on the small table nearby. When he showed her the room, she looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why he was being kind to her. Samuel tried to communicate through gestures that she was safe, that she could sleep here, that no one would hurt her. He wasn't sure how much she understood, but when she saw the bed, her eyes filled with tears. She touched the clean sheets like they were made of gold, then looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. Perhaps both. Before he left her for the night, Samuel made sure she knew where everything was. He showed her the chamber pot in the corner, the extra blanket in case she got cold, and he left the door open so she wouldn't feel trapped. He didn't lock his own bedroom door either. He didn't lock anything. If she wanted to leave during the night, she was free to go. And if others came looking for her, well, he'd deal with that when the time came. As Samuel lay in his own bed that night staring at the ceiling, he wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. His neighbors would call him a fool. They'd say he was putting himself in danger, that you couldn't trust the Apache, that this would only lead to trouble. Maybe they were right. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to turn her away or take her to the authorities in town. But Samuel had stopped caring about what was smart or safe 2 years ago when his wife died. Life had taught him that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, that all the careful planning in the world couldn't protect you from loss and pain. So if he could do one decent thing, one genuinely human thing in this harsh and unforgiving land, then maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more than enough. He thought about the rope burns on her wrists. He thought about how thin she was, how scared. Somewhere out there, this girl had a family. Maybe they were looking for her. Maybe they thought she was dead. Or maybe they'd been killed and she was all alone in the world, just like him. Either way, she was just a child who needed help. Nothing more complicated than that. As sleep finally started to claim him, Samuel heard a soft sound from the spare room. It took him a moment to recognize it. The girl was crying, but trying to stay quiet, probably afraid of disturbing him or maybe afraid of showing weakness. He thought about going to check on her, but decided against it. Sometimes people needed to cry alone. Sometimes tears were the only way to wash away the worst of the pain. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The desert night settled in with its familiar sounds and shadows. And in that small cabin, two lonely souls found themselves under the same roof, neither knowing that this single evening would change everything. That one simple act of kindness, one meal shared with a stranger, would set in motion events that neither of them could possibly imagine. Samuel finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that by morning, his entire world would look very different, unaware that the choice he'd made to help one starving child would lead to something far bigger than himself. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives don't announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a collapsed girl by a water pump on an ordinary August evening. Samuel's eyes opened before dawn like they did every morning. Years of living alone on the frontier had trained his body to wake up with the first hint of light. But something felt different this morning. The air seemed heavier somehow, thicker. There was a silence that wasn't quite right, the kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. He got out of bed and put on his clothes, moving slowly and listening carefully. Everything in the cabin seemed normal. He could hear the girl breathing softly in the spare room, still asleep. That was good. She needed rest more than anything. But outside something was off. Samuel couldn't put his finger on it, but his instincts were screaming that something had changed during the night. He made his way to the kitchen and prepared his usual morning coffee. The ritual helped calm his nerves a bit. As the coffee brewed, filling the small cabin with its familiar smell, Samuel walked toward his front door. He grabbed his tin cup, poured the hot coffee, and stepped out onto the porch like he did every single morning. And then he stopped breathing. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. His entire body went rigid. For a moment he thought he might still be asleep, caught in some vivid dream, but the heat of the coffee in his hand was too real. The morning chill was too real, and what he was seeing was definitely impossibly real. Horses, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle around his property, and on each horse sat an Apache warrior, completely still, completely silent. Samuel's mind struggled to count them. 20, no, more than that. 30 at least. Maybe more. They surrounded his entire homestead, and he hadn't heard a single sound. Not one whinny from a horse. Not one footstep, nothing. The warriors sat like statues carved from stone. Their faces were painted with traditional markings, and even in the dim pre-dawn light, Samuel could see their weapons clearly. Bows, rifles, lances. They weren't hiding their arms or their intentions to be taken seriously. But they also weren't attacking. They were just there, watching, waiting. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he always kept by his door. It was a reflex, nothing more. But the moment his fingers touched the wood, he stopped himself. A strange clarity cut through his initial panic. If these warriors had wanted to kill him, he'd already be dead. They could have attacked during the night when he was sleeping. They could have set fire to his cabin. They could have done 100 different things, and he never would have known what hit him. But they hadn't. Instead, they'd positioned themselves around his home and simply waited for him to wake up. That had to mean something. Samuel's mind raced, trying to understand. This had to be about the girl. It was the only thing that made sense. But were they here to take her back? To punish him for helping her? Or was this something else entirely? The rising sun started to peek over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. The light made the scene even more surreal. The warriors looked like spirits in the morning mist, their horses barely moving except for the occasional swish of a tail or twitch of an ear. Samuel stood frozen on his porch, his coffee growing cold in his trembling hand. He wanted to say something, to call out and ask what they wanted, but his voice seemed to have disappeared. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The standoff continued in absolute silence. Samuel could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool morning air. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. This was the moment his neighbors had warned him about. This was why they'd say he was a fool. And maybe they were right. Maybe his kindness had brought death to his doorstep. Then he heard movement behind him, soft footsteps on the wooden floor of his cabin. Samuel didn't turn around, but he knew the girl had woken up. He could sense her approaching the door, could hear her quiet breathing as she came up behind him. For a moment, he wanted to tell her to go back inside, to hide. But what good would that do? The girl stepped out from behind Samuel and onto the porch. She moved slowly, her bare feet making almost no sound on the old wood. Samuel glanced down at her and saw that her expression had completely changed from the night before. The fear was gone. In its place was something else. Recognition, maybe, or relief. Her eyes were fixed on the circle of warriors, scanning from one face to another. Then she did something Samuel didn't expect. She started walking down the porch steps toward the mounted warriors. Her movements were deliberate but calm, like she knew exactly what was happening and wasn't afraid anymore. Samuel's first instinct was to grab her, to pull her back to safety, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she walked with a strange confidence that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it was the way the warrior's posture changed slightly when they saw her, a subtle relaxation that rippled through the circle. The girl reached the bottom of the steps and stood in the yard, looking up at the warriors. Still no one spoke. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant call of a morning bird. Samuel remained on his porch holding his cold coffee, wondering if he was about to witness something terrible or something he couldn't yet understand. One of the horses moved forward, just a few steps, breaking the perfect circle. The warrior riding it was older than the others, with silver streaking through his long black hair. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind, marked with lines that told stories of a hard life. He sat tall in his saddle, looking down at the girl with an expression that was difficult to read in the growing light. The girl looked up at this particular warrior, and Samuel saw her lip start to tremble. Her small hands clenched into fists at her sides, and her shoulders began to shake. The old warrior dismounted slowly, his movements careful and measured. When his feet touched the ground, he stood there for a moment, just looking at the girl. Then he walked toward her with steps that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Samuel watched, barely breathing, as the old warrior reached the girl. And then something happened that made Samuel's eyes sting with unexpected emotion. The warrior, this fierce-looking man who commanded such obvious respect from the others, knelt down in the dirt in front of the small girl. He reached out and placed his hands gently on her shoulders, looking into her face with an expression of such profound relief and pain that it needed no translation. The girl broke. Whatever strength she'd been holding on to shattered, and she threw her arms around the old warrior's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, and Samuel could see his shoulders shaking too. In that moment, the language barriers, the cultural differences, the history of conflict, none of it mattered. Samuel was watching a reunion between people who loved each other, who'd thought they might never see each other again. Other warriors began to dismount, moving closer, but keeping a respectful distance. Some of them were visibly emotional, wiping at their eyes or looking away to compose themselves. Samuel understood then, with absolute certainty, that these weren't raiders or enemies coming to punish him. These were family members who'd been searching for a lost child. These were people who'd been living through a nightmare, not knowing if she was alive or dead. As the sun continued to rise, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Samuel stood on his porch and watched the scene unfold. His fear had been replaced by something else entirely, a sense of having stumbled into something profound and sacred. A family reunion played out in silence and tears, with 30 witnesses on horseback and one confused homesteader holding a cup of cold coffee. The old warrior finally pulled back from the girl, holding her at arm's length to look at her. He touched her face gently, as if making sure she was real. Then his eyes lifted and found Samuel standing on the porch. Their gazes locked, and Samuel felt the full weight of that look. It was assessing him, measuring him, trying to understand what kind of man would help an Apache child when most would not. Samuel didn't look away. He met the old warrior's eyes steadily, without aggression but without fear either. He had nothing to hide. He'd done what any decent person should do. He'd helped a child in need. If that meant facing consequences this morning, then so be it. But he wouldn't apologize for choosing kindness over fear. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken questions and possibilities. And Samuel knew, standing there in the morning light surrounded by silent warriors, that whatever happened next would define not just this day, but possibly the rest of his life. The old warrior stood up slowly, his hand still resting gently on the girl's shoulders. He spoke a few words to her in Apache, his voice low and soothing. The girl nodded and wiped her tears, then stepped back to stand among the other warriors who had gathered around. The old man turned his full attention to Samuel and began walking toward the porch with deliberate steps. Samuel's grip tightened on his coffee cup. Every instinct told him to stay calm, to show no fear. He'd learned in the war that animals and men alike could smell terror, and it often made situations worse. So he stood his ground, watching the warrior approach. As the man got closer, Samuel could see more details. The deep lines around his eyes, the scars on his arms and chest, visible through his traditional clothing. The silver hair that spoke of many years survived in this brutal land. When the warrior reached the porch, he stopped at the bottom of the steps. He was tall, taller than Samuel, and carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. This was clearly a leader, someone used to making important decisions. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, sizing each other up. Then the warrior did something unexpected. He placed his right hand over his heart and gave a slight bow of his head. It was a gesture of respect, Samuel realized with surprise. The warrior then pointed to himself and said a word that sounded like Nantan. He repeated it, gesturing to himself again. His name, Samuel understood. He was introducing himself. Samuel set down his coffee cup and mimicked the gesture, placing his hand over his own heart. Samuel, he said clearly, then repeated it. Samuel Chen. The warrior, Nantan, nodded slowly, acknowledging the introduction, but now came the hard part. They needed to communicate, and Samuel spoke no Apache beyond a few words he'd picked up over the years. Nantan seemed to recognize the problem too. He turned and called out something to the gathered warriors. A younger man stepped forward, dismounting from his horse and approaching them. This younger warrior looked to be in his 20s with sharp, intelligent eyes. Nantan spoke to him rapidly in Apache, and the young man nodded. Then he turned to Samuel and spoke in broken Spanish. "You speak Spanish?" he asked. Samuel felt a wave of relief. Spanish was the common language in these parts, the bridge between many different peoples. His Spanish wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. "Yes," he replied in Spanish. "I speak Spanish." The young man nodded and turned back to Nantan, translating. From that point on, he served as the interpreter, though the conversation moved slowly as words passed through multiple languages. But at least they could talk. At least there was a way to understand each other. Nantan began to speak, and the interpreter translated his words into Spanish. The story that emerged made Samuel's chest tighten with anger and sadness. The girl's name was Dahana, which meant something like pure or clear in their language. She was Nantan's granddaughter, his son's only child. 3 weeks ago, she'd been taken by Mexican slavers who'd raided their camp, while most of the warriors were away hunting. Samuel's jaw clenched. He knew about the slave trade that still operated in these territories, though most people didn't talk about it openly. Apache children, especially girls, were valuable to the traders who sold them to wealthy families in Mexico or further south. It was a brutal business that everyone knew about, but few had the power or will to stop. Nantan continued his story, his weathered face showing the strain of the past weeks. They'd tracked the slavers for days, following their trail south. There had been a fight. Some of the slavers were killed, others escaped. But Dahana wasn't with them anymore. Somewhere along the way, she'd either been sold already or had escaped. The trail went cold. For the past week, Nantan and his warriors had been searching desperately, following any clue, asking the spirits for guidance. They'd expanded their search in all directions, hoping against hope that she was still alive. Apache children were taught from a young age how to survive in the desert. But Dahana had been gone so long without supplies or water that most of them had started to fear the worst. Yesterday, they'd picked up her trail again. Pure luck, or maybe something more. The signs led them here to Samuel's small homestead. When they'd arrived in the dark hours before dawn and seen smoke from his chimney, they'd prepared themselves for heartbreak. They'd seen too many times what happened to their children in the hands of white settlers. They'd expected to find her dead or worse. Instead, they'd positioned themselves around the property and waited. They'd sent scouts to peek through the windows. Those scouts had reported back something that none of them had expected. Dahana was alive, sleeping peacefully in a bed, looking fed and cared for. The white man in the house hadn't chained her or hurt her. He'd given her his spare room. Nantan's voice grew thick with emotion as the interpreter translated this part. The old chief explained that they hadn't known what to make of it. It seemed too good to be true. So they'd waited for dawn, waited to see what kind of man this Samuel Chen was. Would he try to stop them from taking Dahana? Would there be a fight? They'd been prepared for anything except what actually happened. When Dahana walked out to us without fear, the interpreter translated, we knew she had been treated with kindness. A child who has been hurt does not walk freely toward her people. She runs, she hides, she shows the damage done to her spirit. But Dahana walked like a child who had been safe. That is not something we expected to find in a white man's house. Samuel listened to all of this with a mixture of emotions churning in his gut. Relief that he'd made the right choice. Anger at what had been done to this child and her family. And something else he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just the recognition that despite everything, despite all the violence and hatred between their peoples, they were all just humans trying to protect the ones they loved. I only did what anyone should do, Samuel said simply in Spanish. She was starving. She was hurt. I couldn't turn away a child in need. The interpreter translated this to Nantan, who listened carefully. The old chief's eyes never left Samuel's face, studying him like he was trying to read the truth behind the words. Then Nantan spoke again, a longer speech this time. My grandfather says, the interpreter began, that many would not have done what you did. Many of your people see us as less than human, as animals to be hunted or removed. Just as many of our people see yours the same way. Too much blood has been spilled between us, too many wrongs that can never be made right. He says the world is changing, and not in good ways for our people. We are being pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. Our children are taken to schools far away where they are told to forget who they are. Our way of life is ending. Samuel nodded slowly. He'd seen the reservations, heard the stories. He knew the Apache were fighting a losing battle against the tide of settlers and soldiers pouring into the territory. It was a tragic situation with no easy answers. But then Nantan said something that caught Samuel completely off guard. The interpreter's eyes widened slightly as he translated. My grandfather says that finding a white man who would show kindness to an Apache child without asking for anything in return, has made him think. He believes that perhaps not all bridges between our peoples must be burned. Perhaps there is still a chance for understanding even now, even after everything. Samuel wasn't sure what to say to that. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The weight of what was being suggested hung in the air between them. Nantan spoke again, and this time his words came out in a rush, like he'd been thinking about this and needed to get it out before he changed his mind. The interpreter struggled to keep up, translating as quickly as he could. My grandfather wants to make a proposal. He knows it is unusual. He knows both your people and ours will think he is crazy, but he is old, and old men sometimes get to do crazy things because they have earned that right. Samuel found himself leaning forward, curious despite his apprehension. What kind of proposal? And then Nantan laid out an idea so unexpected, so bold, that Samuel had to ask the interpreter to repeat it twice just to make sure he'd understood correctly. The old chief wanted to create an arrangement between them, a partnership of sorts, something that would benefit both sides and maybe, just maybe, serve as a small light in a very dark time. Samuel stared at Nantan, trying to process what he'd just heard. The interpreter shifted his weight nervously, waiting for a response. The other warriors had moved closer, sensing that something important was being discussed. Even Dahana was watching intently, though Samuel doubted she understood the Spanish being spoken. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Samuel said slowly in Spanish. You want me to teach Dahana to read and write English? And to do arithmetic, numbers, and mathematics? The interpreter nodded and translated for Nantan. The old chief responded firmly, his hands moving as he spoke to emphasize his points. Yes, the interpreter translated. My grandfather says the white man's world runs on paper and numbers. Treaties are written on paper. Land is bought and sold with numbers. Our people have been tricked many times because we could not read what was written, or understand the counting of money in acres. He says if we are to survive in this new world, some of our people must learn these things. Samuel rubbed his jaw, thinking. It made sense in a harsh, practical way. The Apache were facing a future where their traditional ways of life were being systematically destroyed. Knowing how to read and write English, how to understand contracts and documents could mean the difference between being cheated and being able to fight back, at least legally. But why me? Samuel asked. Surely there are others who could teach her. Schools, missionaries, people who do this kind of work. Nantan's response came quickly, with an edge of bitterness that needed no translation. The interpreter's voice carried that same emotion. The schools take our children and do not give them back. They cut their hair, beat them for speaking their own language, try to kill the Apache inside them. The missionaries want to change who we are, to make us ashamed of our beliefs. My grandfather says these people do not teach, they erase. He wants someone who will teach Dahana to read and count without trying to destroy who she is. That hit Samuel hard. He'd heard stories about the boarding schools, about the kill the Indian save the man philosophy that drove them. Children torn from their families, forbidden from speaking their own languages or practicing their traditions. It was cultural destruction dressed up as education, and everyone knew it even if they didn't say it out loud. And in exchange, Samuel asked, because nothing in this world came free. What would you offer for this teaching? Nantan smiled slightly at that. The first time Samuel had seen anything close to warmth on the old chief's face. He spoke at length, gesturing to the land around them, to his warriors, to the desert beyond. Protection, the interpreter translated. Your land will be safe. Your water sources will remain clean. No Apache will trouble you or steal from you. More than that, we will teach you things. How to find water in places where it seems there is none. Which plants can heal and which can kill. How to read the signs of the desert so you are never lost. My grandfather says you live alone in a hard land. This knowledge could save your life someday. Samuel had to admit it was a generous offer. More than generous. The knowledge the Apache had about surviving in this desert had been built up over generations. Settlers often struggled and died from simple ignorance, not knowing which water sources were safe or how to read the weather signs. And having protection from raids wasn't nothing either, though Samuel had to wonder how much one chief could actually promise. But there was something else bothering him. How often would this teaching happen? How long? The interpreter relayed the question, and Nantan responded thoughtfully. 2 days each week during the growing season and the cooling season. When the hot months come and when the deep cold arrives, we will be far from here, in other camps, so perhaps 8 or 9 months of the year. My grandfather says Dahana is quick to learn. She already knows some Spanish. He believes she could learn to read and write in perhaps 2 or 3 years if the teaching is good. 2 or 3 years. Samuel thought about that. It was a long commitment, a long time to tie himself to this arrangement. What would his neighbors say? What would happen if the tensions between settlers and Apache exploded into open warfare again? He could be seen as a traitor, a collaborator. His life could become very difficult, even dangerous. But then he looked at Dahana standing quietly among the warriors. This small girl who'd been kidnapped by slavers, who'd somehow escaped and wandered through the desert until she collapsed at his water pump. She'd survived all that. Didn't she deserve a chance to learn, to grow, to have some tools to face the future? Didn't any child deserve that regardless of their background? Samuel took a deep breath. Can I ask why you're offering this to me? You could probably force me to teach her if you wanted. You have 30 warriors here and I'm one man. Why make it an exchange? Why offer me anything? Nantan's response was immediate, and the interpreter's voice carried a note of pride as he translated. My grandfather says that things taken by force are not the same as things given freely. If he forced you to teach Dahana, you might teach her wrong things or poorly or with hidden anger. Children know when they are not wanted. They feel it even if nothing is said. But if you agree to this freely, if you choose to teach her, then she will truly learn. Also, he says a man who showed kindness to a starving child without being asked is not a man who should be threatened or forced. That would dishonor what you did. Something in Samuel's chest loosened at those words. Here was a man who'd lost so much, whose people were facing extinction of their way of life, who'd just gotten his granddaughter back from slavers, and he was talking about honor and respect, about doing things the right way even when the wrong way would be easier. Samuel had been alone for 2 years now. 2 years of talking to himself, of eating meals in silence, of wondering what the point of it all was. His wife was gone. They'd never had children. He worked his land, survived each day, but for what? Maybe this was an answer. Maybe this strange, impossible proposal was exactly what he needed, even if he didn't know it yet. "I have conditions," Samuel said finally. The interpreter perked up, translating quickly. Nantan nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "Dahana must be free to leave at any time. If she doesn't want to come, she doesn't have to. I won't force education on anyone. Second, I teach her honestly. I won't hide things or make them simpler than they are. If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. Third, if war breaks out between our peoples again, this arrangement protects me from nothing. I understand that. I'm not asking for promises that can't be kept." Nantan listened to the translation carefully, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. Then he spoke, a shorter response this time. "My grandfather agrees to all of this. He adds one more thing. If you ever need help, if you are in danger or need assistance, you send word. We will come. This is not just about teaching. This is about trust. You trusted Dahana when you fed her. We trust you now. Trust must go both ways or it is meaningless." Samuel felt the weight of that settling on his shoulders. This was real. This was actually happening. He was about to enter into an arrangement that would have seemed impossible just yesterday morning. An arrangement that would tie his fate to an Apache family, that would make him different from every other settler in the territory. "Then I agree," Samuel said simply. "I'll teach Dahana to read, to write, to understand numbers and mathematics. I'll teach her honestly and well. And I'll accept your offer of protection and knowledge in return." Nantan's face broke into a genuine smile. He stepped up onto the porch, moving past Samuel into the cabin without hesitation. Samuel followed, curious. The old chief looked around the small space, taking in the simple furniture, the books on the shelf, the clean but sparse living area. He nodded approvingly, then called out to Dahana. The girl came inside, still looking between her grandfather and Samuel with wide eyes. She clearly hadn't expected any of this. Nantan knelt down and spoke to her softly in Apache, his hands on her shoulders. She listened intently, then looked at Samuel. Slowly, carefully, she walked over to him and held out her small hand. Samuel took it gently, shaking it like he would with any adult. Dahana's grip was surprisingly firm for such a small girl. She said something in Apache that Samuel didn't understand, but the interpreter had followed them inside. She says thank you. For the food, for the bed, for being kind. She says she will work hard to learn what you teach her. Tell her, Samuel said, that I'll do my best to be a good teacher, and that she's welcome here whenever she comes. As the interpreter translated this, Dahana smiled for the first time since Samuel had found her. It transformed her whole face, making her look like the child she should have been all along, instead of the frightened, starving creature who'd collapsed by his water pump. Nantan stood and clasped Samuel's arm in a firm grip, the kind of greeting between equals. They stood there for a moment, two men from completely different worlds, bound now by an agreement that neither of them fully understood the implications of. But sometimes the most important decisions are made on instinct rather than careful planning. Sometimes you just have to trust that you're doing the right thing and hope the rest works out. Outside, the sun had fully risen. The desert was warming up, promising another hot day. The warriors were already mounting their horses, preparing to leave. 3 days passed before Samuel saw anyone again. He'd half convinced himself that the whole thing had been some kind of fever dream. 30 warriors surrounding his cabin at dawn? An agreement with an Apache chief? It seemed too strange to be real. But then on Tuesday morning, just as the sun was clearing the eastern hills, Dahana appeared. She didn't knock. She simply walked up to the porch where Samuel was having his coffee and stood there waiting. She was wearing the same clothes as before, now cleaned and mended, and her hair was braided neatly. She looked healthier already, her face not quite so hollow, though she was still far too thin. "Good morning," Samuel said in English, then repeated it in Spanish. "Buenos dias," Dahana responded in Spanish, which surprised him. "Buenos dias." Her accent was thick, but the words were clear enough. So she did know some Spanish, just as Nantan had said. Samuel gestured toward the door. "Come inside. We should start." He wasn't sure what he was doing, had no real plan for how to teach someone to read, but he figured they'd figure it out together. Inside, Samuel cleared off his small table and brought out the books his wife had owned. There weren't many. A Bible, naturally. A collection of folk tales. A basic primer that they'd bought years ago when they'd hoped for children. and a few newspapers from Santa Fe that Samuel kept meaning to throw away but never did. Dahana sat at the table, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She watched everything Samuel did with intense focus, like she was trying to memorize each movement. Samuel pulled out the primer and opened it to the first page. Pictures of simple objects with letters beneath them: an apple, a bird, a cat. "Okay," Samuel said, pointing to the letter A. "This is the letter A. It makes a sound like ah." He exaggerated the sound, showing her how his mouth moved. "Ah." Dahana repeated it, watching his mouth carefully. "Ah. Good. Now this word is apple. Apple, apple." He pointed to the picture, then to the letters, then back to his mouth as he said it again slowly. "Apple. Apple," Dahana repeated. Her pronunciation wasn't perfect, but it was close enough for a first try. They spent the next 2 hours going through the first few pages of the primer. Samuel quickly realized that Dahana was indeed quick to learn, just as her grandfather had said. She absorbed information like a sponge soaking up water. By the end of that first session, she could recognize and sound out 5 letters and knew a dozen simple words. But more impressive than her memory was her determination. She never got frustrated, never complained when Samuel corrected her pronunciation. She just tried again, focused completely on the task. It reminded Samuel of soldiers he'd known during the war. The ones who survived because they could focus on the mission, no matter what was happening around them. When the sun was high overhead, Samuel realized they'd been at it for hours. "Are you hungry?" he asked in Spanish, gesturing toward the kitchen. Dahana nodded, and Samuel could have sworn he saw the hint of a smile. He made them both lunch, simple fare again, and they ate in comfortable silence. Dahana watched him as they ate, studying him like she was still trying to figure him out. Samuel didn't mind. He was doing the same thing, trying to understand this quiet, serious girl who'd stumbled into his life. After lunch, they worked on writing. Samuel gave her a slate and chalk, showing her how to form the letters they'd learned. Her first attempts were shaky, the letters wobbly and uneven, but she practiced each one over and over, erasing and redrawing until she got it right. Samuel found himself impressed by her patience with herself. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel taught her numbers too. 1 through 10 in English and in written form. Dahana already understood counting in Apache and Spanish, so it was just a matter of learning the English words and how to write the numerals. She picked it up quickly, and by the end of the day she could write all 10 numbers without hesitation. When the sun started to drop toward the western horizon, Dahana stood up from the table. She looked at Samuel and said carefully in English, "Thank you, teacher." The words were heavily accented but clear. Samuel felt a strange warmth in his chest. "You're welcome, Dahana. You did very well today. Same time on Thursday?" She nodded, understanding the question if not every word. Then she was gone, slipping out the door and disappearing into the desert with the kind of silent grace that Samuel was learning was typical of her people. Thursday came, and Dahana was there right on time. This time she had her younger brother with her. The boy looked to be about 9 or 10, skinny and serious-faced like his sister. Samuel hadn't expected this, but he didn't object. The more who learned, the better, right? The boy's name was Tanito, and he was even shyer than Dahana. He barely spoke at all for the first hour, just watched his sister work and occasionally glanced at Samuel like he expected to be sent away. But Samuel treated him the same as Dahana, patient and encouraging, and gradually the boy relaxed enough to start participating. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Dahana would arrive in the morning. Sometimes alone, sometimes with Tanito. They would work until midday, break for lunch, then continue until the afternoon heat made it hard to concentrate. Samuel found himself looking forward to these days, the cabin feeling less empty with students in it. And the arrangement worked both ways. One morning, Samuel found fresh venison hanging from his porch roof, already cleaned and ready to cook. He hadn't heard anyone approach during the night. Another time, he woke to find that 3 of his fence posts, which had been broken for weeks, had been replaced with new, stronger timber. He'd been putting off the repair because it was hard work for one man, but someone had done it while he slept. The water pump, which had been squeaky and difficult, suddenly worked smoothly. His small vegetable garden, which he'd honestly been neglecting, started growing better. Samuel would sometimes find it had been watered during the night or weeded, or the soil had been enriched with something that made the plants stronger. He never saw who did these things, They happened silently and visibly like gifts from ghosts. But Samuel knew. Nantan was keeping his end of the bargain. The Apache were protecting his home, helping in small ways that made his life easier. It was strange and wonderful and a little unsettling all at once, but not everyone was happy about the arrangement. Samuel's nearest neighbor, a hard-bitten rancher named Bill Peterson, rode over one day and confronted him directly. "Heard you've been teaching Apache children," Peterson said, his voice hostile. "That true?" Samuel didn't bother lying. "It's true. Are you insane?" Peterson's face was red with anger. "Those savages killed my cousin 3 years ago. They've raided my stock, burned settlers' homes. And you're teaching them to read? You might as well be training them to fight us better." "I'm teaching a little girl her letters," Samuel said calmly. "That's all." "She's 12 years old, Peterson. Whatever your cousin's killers did, she didn't do it." "It's all the same," Peterson spat. "Apache is Apache. You're making a mistake, Chen, a big one. And when they turn on you, don't come crying to the rest of us for help." Samuel watched him ride away and knew that conversation would be repeated to others. The rumors would spread. He was now marked as different as someone who sympathized with the Apache. Some settlers would shun him. Others might try to cause him trouble. It was exactly what he'd expected, but it still stung. Yet when Thursday came and Dahana arrived for her lesson, Samuel put it all aside. She greeted him with "Good morning, teacher," in carefully practiced English, and they went inside to work. She was reading simple sentences now, sounding out words she didn't know, her finger following the text line by line. It was slow going, but she was making real progress. One afternoon, after they'd been working together for about 2 months, something special happened. Dahana was reading from the book of folk tales, struggling through a story about a clever rabbit. She got stuck on a word, frowned at it, then suddenly her face lit up. "I know this word. It's beautiful. Beautiful rabbit." She said it with such pride, such genuine joy at figuring it out on her own, that Samuel couldn't help but smile. "That's exactly right. Beautiful. Well done." Dahana looked up from the book and her whole face was transformed by her grin. "I can read," she said in English. "I am reading." "Yes, you are," Samuel confirmed. "You're reading." In that moment, Samuel understood why teachers did what they did. This feeling of watching someone's world expand, of seeing knowledge open new doors in their mind, it was something special, something that made all the difficulty and risk worthwhile. As autumn approached and the temperatures started to cool, Samuel realized something had changed in his life. He wasn't lonely anymore. Oh, he was still alone most of the time, and he still missed his wife with an ache that never quite went away. But the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. His days had purpose. He had students to prepare for, lessons to plan, progress to track. And beyond that, he had something he hadn't had in years. He had a connection to other people, not just Dahana and Tanito, but through them to Nantan and the Apache band. He'd see warriors occasionally in the distance watching over his land. Once he'd encountered a hunting party while checking his fence line. They'd nodded to him respectfully and he'd nodded back. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. Winter came to the New Mexico territory with its usual harshness. The days grew short and cold, and the lessons continued despite the chill. Samuel had fashioned a better wood stove to keep the cabin warm, and Dahana and Tanito would arrive bundled in hide clothing, their breath visible in the morning air. They'd warm themselves by the stove while Samuel prepared hot tea, then settle in for their studies. Dahana could now read full paragraphs without help, her vocabulary growing every week. She'd moved beyond the simple primer to actual books, and she devoured them with a hunger that reminded Samuel of her first meal in his cabin. Tanito, though younger, was proving just as capable. The boy had a natural gift for numbers that surprised Samuel. Give him a mathematics problem and he'd work through it methodically, his face scrunched in concentration until he found the answer. It was in late February when everything changed. Samuel had gone to bed as usual one cold night, the wind howling outside his cabin. He was deep in sleep when a sound woke him. Not a loud sound, but something that didn't belong. The soft nicker of horses. Multiple horses. Samuel's eyes opened in the darkness. He lay still, listening. There it was again. Horses close to the cabin. His hand moved slowly toward the rifle beside his bed. Could be wild horses, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. Wild horses didn't come this close to human dwellings. He got up quietly and moved to the window, staying to the side where he couldn't be seen. The moon was bright enough to see by, and what he saw made his stomach drop. Riders, at least a dozen of them, sitting on horses just beyond his property, and he recognized the silhouettes. Apache warriors, but something was wrong. They weren't in their usual positions. There was a tension in their posture, an urgency in the way they were clustered together. Samuel watched for a moment, then made a decision. He pulled on his clothes quickly and grabbed his coat. Whatever this was, hiding inside wouldn't help. He opened his door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit him like a slap, but he ignored it. "Hello?" he called out in Spanish. "What's happening?" One of the riders moved forward, and Samuel recognized the interpreter who'd helped him speak with Nantan months ago. The young man looked agitated, his horse prancing nervously beneath him. "Samuel Chen," the interpreter called out, also in Spanish. "Nantan asks if you have seen white men pass through here." Men with stolen horses, Samuel's mind raced. He had seen riders, actually. 2 days ago, a group of rough-looking men had passed by his property heading east. He'd watched them from a distance, not liking the look of them. They'd had extra horses with them, and something about the way they moved had seemed furtive, guilty. But he hadn't known they were thieves. "I saw men 2 days ago," Samuel called back honestly. 5 or 6 of them with extra horses. They went east, toward the canyon. The interpreter translated this to the others. There was a brief, intense discussion among the warriors. Then the interpreter turned back to Samuel. "Those men attacked our hunting party yesterday. They killed 2 of our warriors and took their horses. We have tracked them to near here." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This was exactly the kind of situation that could explode into violence. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said carefully. "The men I saw were strangers to me. I don't know them." There was more discussion among the warriors. Then, to Samuel's complete surprise, Nantan himself emerged from the group. The old chief rode forward until he was close enough to speak without shouting. His face was grave in the moonlight. "Samuel Chen," Nantan said in halting Spanish, apparently not wanting to wait for translation. "We tracked these men. They are camped 3 miles from here. We can go, we can fight, we can take back what is ours and revenge our dead." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But if we do this, there will be soldiers. There will be more fighting. More death. Always more death." Samuel understood what wasn't being said. If the Apache attacked a group of white men, even thieves and murderers, the army would respond. They'd use it as an excuse to crack down harder on the Apache bands, maybe force more of them onto reservations. It didn't matter that the Apache were in the right. It never mattered. "What do you want from me?" Samuel asked, though he was starting to suspect he knew. Nantan leaned forward in his saddle. "You are a white man. You speak for us. We go together, we ask for horses back, we ask for justice. Not war. Justice. Maybe they listened to you when they would not listen to us." Samuel's blood ran cold. What Nantan was asking was incredibly dangerous. If he rode with the Apache to confront these men, he could be killed in the crossfire. If things went wrong and the Apache attacked, he could be seen as part of it. But if he refused, the Apache would likely attack anyway, and the fragile peace they'd built would mean nothing. "You're asking me to risk my life," Samuel said bluntly. "Yes," Nantan replied, equally blunt. "Just as you risked your life when you fed Dahana. Just as you risk your life every time you teach her. This is different risk, yes, but same choice. Do what is right or do what is safe." Samuel stood on his porch in the cold February night, looking at the old chief and the warriors behind him. Some of those warriors were young, maybe younger than the 2 who'd been killed. They were looking at him with a mixture of hope and suspicion, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. He thought about Dahana, carefully sounding out words in the warm cabin. He thought about Tanito, his face lighting up when he solved a difficult problem. He thought about his wife, who'd always said that a life lived in fear wasn't really living at all. "Give me 5 minutes to get properly dressed and saddle my horse," Samuel said. "I'll come with you." The interpreter translated, and Samuel heard murmurs run through the group. Nantan nodded slowly, something like respect in his eyes. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Samuel Chen." "Probably both," Samuel muttered as he went back inside. His hands shook as he pulled on warmer clothes and loaded his rifle. What was he doing? This was insane. He should stay here, lock his door, let the Apache handle their own problems. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. He'd made a choice months ago when he fed a starving girl. This was just the logical continuation of that choice. 10 minutes later, Samuel was on his horse, riding through the cold night with a dozen Apache warriors. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the horses' hooves on the hard ground and the wind whistling through the rocks. Samuel had never felt more aware of his own mortality. Every shadow could hide danger. Every sound could be the prelude to violence. They traveled for about an hour before the interpreter held up his hand, signaling everyone to stop. He pointed ahead to where a small fire was visible in a depression between two hills. The drifters' camp. Samuel could see horses tied up nearby, too many horses for just 5 or 6 men. Nantan gathered everyone close and spoke quietly. The interpreter translated for Samuel. We approach slowly. Samuel goes first, speaking in English. We stay back but close. If they attack Samuel, we respond. If they agree to talk, we talk. Everyone understand? The warriors nodded. Samuel nodded too, even though his mouth had gone completely dry. He was about to ride into a camp of dangerous men who'd already killed and tried to negotiate on behalf of the Apache. This was definitely the most foolish thing he'd ever done. They approached the camp in a wide line, making no attempt to hide. Better to be seen coming than to sneak up and provoke a violent response. As they got closer, Samuel could see men scrambling to their feet, reaching for weapons. There were shouts of alarm. "Hold your fire!" Samuel called out in English. "We're not attacking. We just want to talk." "Who the hell are you?" a voice shouted back. Samuel could see a man standing by the fire, rifle in hand, peering into the darkness. "My name is Samuel Chen. I have a homestead a few miles west of here. These men with me are Apache. You killed 2 of their people yesterday and took their horses. They want them back." There was a moment of silence, then harsh laughter. "You rode here with savages to ask us to give back horses? Are you out of your mind?" Samuel urged his horse forward a few more steps, moving into the firelight so they could see him clearly. He kept his rifle pointed at the ground, non-threatening. "Those horses belong to the Apache. You murdered 2 men to steal them. That's a hanging offense anywhere in this territory. The Apache could have attacked your camp tonight and killed you all. They'd have been within their rights. Instead, they're giving you a chance to do the right thing." Another man spoke up, younger and more aggressive. "We don't negotiate with Indians. And we sure don't answer to some Chinese who thinks he's a peace officer. Ride out of here now or we'll shoot you and them." Samuel felt the situation slipping away. He could sense the warriors behind him tensing, preparing for violence. If shooting started, people would die, probably including him. He needed to change the equation somehow. "You're not thinking this through," Samuel said, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "If you refuse, the Apache will attack. You might kill some of them, but they'll kill you too. All of you. Then your bodies will be found, and people will say the Apache murdered innocent travelers. That's how these things start." He paused, letting that sink in. "But if you give back the horses and ride out of this territory, everyone lives. You lose some stolen property, but you keep your lives." The standoff stretched into long, tense seconds. Samuel could see the drifters looking at each other, weighing their options. Behind him, he heard the soft creak of leather as the Apache warriors readied their weapons. One wrong move, one nervous trigger pull, and this whole thing would explode into bloodshed. The man by the fire, who seemed to be the leader, spat into the dirt. "You're asking us to just hand over valuable horses because some Indians claim they're theirs? I'm asking you to return stolen property to avoid getting killed," Samuel corrected. He gestured behind him without taking his eyes off the drifters. "There are a dozen warriors back there. How many of you are there? 5, 6? The math isn't in your favor." "We've got cover here," another drifter said, his voice shaking slightly. "We could hold them off. For how long?" Samuel asked. "An hour, 2? And then what?" "Even if you survive, word will get out. The army will come looking. They'll find Apache horses in your possession and 2 dead Apache warriors on your trail. How do you think that story ends for you?" The leader was quiet for a moment, thinking. Samuel could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. These men were clearly criminals, probably wanted somewhere already. The last thing they needed was more attention from authorities. And fighting a dozen Apache warriors, even from a defensive position, was likely to end badly for them. "What about payment?" the leader finally asked. "We've got to get something out of this." Samuel felt a flash of anger. "Payment? You murdered 2 men. You don't get paid for that? Then I guess we've got nothing more to talk about." The leader started to raise his rifle. Samuel acted on pure instinct. "Wait!" He reached into his coat pocket slowly, making sure everyone could see his hands. I have $20 on me. That's all the money I have in the world right now, but it's yours. Take it, give back the horses, and ride out. Consider it payment for your trouble, not for the murders, but for making the smart choice to stay alive. Behind him, he heard Nantan say something sharp in Apache. The interpreter translated quietly. He says you do not need to give these dogs your money. It's just money, Samuel said without turning around. Lives are worth more. The drifters huddled together, speaking in low voices. Samuel sat on his horse, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. His $20 represented 3 months of careful saving. It was supposed to buy supplies for the spring planting. But if it bought peace tonight, if it kept everyone alive, it was worth it. Finally, the leader stepped forward. $40. 20 from you, and the Indians give us 20 more. Plus they let us keep our weapons and our own horses. Those are the terms. Samuel turned to look at Nantan. The old chief's face was hard as stone in the moonlight. Samuel could see the war happening behind his eyes. The desire for vengeance fighting against practical wisdom. For a long moment Samuel thought Nantan would refuse, would order an attack instead. Then Nantan spoke in Apache, a short, sharp sentence. One of the younger warriors protested, but Nantan cut him off with a gesture. The interpreter leaned close to Samuel. He agrees. He says the silver in his pouch is cursed with the blood of our dead brothers, and he is happy to curse these men with it. Samuel turned back to the drifters. You have a deal. 20 from me, 20 from the Apache. You give back the stolen horses and your weapons. Then you ride out and never come back to this territory. If any of you are seen here again, the deal is off. Our weapons? The leader's face darkened. That wasn't part of it. It is now, Samuel said firmly. You killed 2 men. You're getting money you don't deserve and your lives. The weapons are the price for the murders. Take it or leave it. More muttering among the drifters. Samuel could see they didn't like it, but they were also smart enough to realize they were in a bad position. Finally, the leader nodded curtly. Fine, but we keep our knives. A man can't travel without a knife. Knives only, Samuel agreed. No rifles, no pistols. The exchange happened slowly, carefully, everyone watching everyone else for signs of betrayal. Samuel rode forward alone, holding out his $20. The leader took it, counting the bills slowly by firelight. Then Nantan approached, his horse moving with careful dignity. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small leather bag. He tossed it to the leader, who caught it and looked inside. Silver coins glinted in the firelight. Now the horses and weapons, Samuel said. The drifters began gathering the stolen Apache horses, 5 in total. Beautiful animals, clearly well cared for by their previous owners. As they brought them forward, other drifters began laying down weapons. Rifles, pistols, even a shotgun. It was an impressive arsenal, and Samuel suddenly understood how much danger they'd all been in. These men had been well armed and clearly ready to use violence, but it was what happened next that burned into Samuel's memory forever. As the weapons were being laid down, one of the younger drifters, barely 20 years old, couldn't stop himself from running his mouth. This is wrong, he said loudly. We should fight. They're just Indians, they're not even real people. The words hung in the cold night air. Samuel saw every Apache warrior stiffen. He saw Nantan's hand move toward the lance strapped to his saddle. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip into violence. Samuel turned his horse to face the young drifter. When he spoke, his voice carried a cold fury that surprised even himself. That Indian chief you're insulting? He's teaching his granddaughter to read because he knows the world is changing, and his people need to adapt to survive. Those warriors behind him? They're fathers and brothers and sons just like you. They feel pain when they're hurt and grief when they lose loved ones just like you. The only difference between you and them is that they have honor. They could have killed you all tonight while you slept, but they chose to try talking first. That's more humanity than you've shown. The young drifter's face flushed red, but he stayed quiet. The leader shot him a warning look that clearly said to shut up before he got them all killed. The weapons exchange continued in tense silence. When it was done, the drifters had their money and their knives. The Apache had their horses and a pile of weapons. Samuel sat between the two groups, feeling like the only thing keeping them from tearing into each other. Now ride, Samuel said to the drifters. East, away from here. And don't come back. The leader nodded stiffly. Within minutes, the drifters had broken camp and were mounted up. As they rode past, heading east like Samuel had directed, the leader paused briefly. You're a fool, Chen. Those savages will turn on you someday. And when they do, remember that I warned you." Samuel didn't respond. He just watched them ride away into the darkness until they disappeared. Only when they were completely out of sight did he allow himself to slump slightly in his saddle, the tension draining out of him like water from a broken barrel. Nantan rode up beside him. The old chief looked at Samuel for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He reached out and clasped Samuel's shoulder, a gesture of respect and gratitude. No words were needed. They both knew how close they'd come to disaster. They both knew that Samuel's intervention had saved lives on both sides. The interpreter came over, leading the recovered horses. "My chief says what you did tonight required great courage. He says you stood between two groups of armed men, knowing either side could kill you because you believed peace was possible. He has known many warriors in his life, but few with courage like that." Samuel shook his head. "It wasn't courage. I was terrified the whole time." "Courage is not the absence of fear," the interpreter translated Nantan's response. "It is acting rightly despite fear. You did what needed to be done, knowing the cost might be your life. That is the definition of bravery." One of the younger warriors, the one who'd argued against making the deal, rode forward. He said something in Apache, his tone respectful now rather than angry. The interpreter smiled. "He says he is sorry he doubted the wisdom of involving you. He says he understands now why his chief trusts you. He asks if you will accept his apology." "Of course," Samuel said, nodding to the young warrior. "You wanted justice for your fallen brothers. There's no shame in that." They rode back toward Samuel's homestead together, moving slowly through the cold night. The mood was different now, lighter somehow despite the circumstances. A crisis had been averted. No new blood had been spilled. The lost horses had been recovered. It wasn't perfect justice, the two murdered warriors were still dead, but it was the best justice they could get in this imperfect world. When they reached Samuel's cabin, dawn was just starting to lighten the eastern sky. Samuel was exhausted, running on nothing but nervous energy. Nantan dismounted and approached the porch where Samuel stood. Through the interpreter, the old chief spoke. "Tonight you proved something important. You proved that there can be justice between our peoples that does not require death. The young men needed to see this. They are angry, always so angry at what has been done to us. They want to fight, to strike back. But fighting will only destroy what little we have left. You showed them another way." "I just wanted everyone to live through the night," Samuel said honestly. "That alone makes you wiser than most men," Nantan replied. He reached up and removed a band from his wrist, a braided leather cord with small beads woven into it. He held it out to Samuel. The years passed in the way that years do, each season blending into the next. Samuel continued teaching Dahana and Tanito, watching them grow from struggling students into confident readers and writers. Dahana, in particular, showed a gift for language that amazed him. By her third year of lessons, she was reading books that would challenge many adult settlers. She devoured everything Samuel could provide, from newspapers to novels to even technical manuals he'd ordered from Santa Fe. Tanito excelled at mathematics, just as Samuel had suspected he would. The boy could calculate complex problems in his head, faster than Samuel could write them on paper. He understood geometry and algebra with an intuitive grasp that suggested he might have made a fine engineer in a different world, in a different time. But the world around them was changing, and not for the better. More settlers poured into the territory every year. The railroad was coming closer, bringing with it the full weight of American expansion. The Apache bands were being pressured harder and harder to move onto reservations. There were more skirmishes, more conflicts, more bloodshed on both sides. Samuel heard the stories in town when he went for supplies. The other settlers mostly avoided him now, knowing about his arrangement with Nantan's people. A few still spoke to him out of old friendship or simple decency, but most treated him like he'd betrayed his own kind. Samuel didn't argue with them. He just bought what he needed and returned to his homestead, where Dahana and Tanito would be waiting for their next lesson. Nantan visited sometimes, usually unannounced. The old chief was aging visibly, his hair now completely white, his movements slower, but his mind was as sharp as ever, and he and Samuel would sit on the porch in the evenings, communicating through a mixture of Spanish gestures and the understanding that had grown between them over the years. They talked about the changing world, about the future that seemed increasingly uncertain. "My people will be forced onto the reservation soon," Nantan said one evening through the interpreter. who still accompanied him on these visits. "The army is coming with more soldiers. They say we can go peacefully or be taken by force. There is no third choice." Samuel didn't try to offer false comfort. They both knew the reality of the situation. "What will you do?" "We will go peacefully," Nantan said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We will go because if we fight, they will kill us all. The young men want to resist, to die fighting rather than live in cages. But I am old and I have seen too much death. Our people need to survive, even if survival means giving up everything we were." "Dahana and Tanito," Samuel asked. "What will happen to them?" "They will go to the reservation with us," Nantan replied. "But what you have taught them will go with them too. Dahana can read and write better than most white men. Tanito understands numbers and mathematics. These skills will help them, help our people. The white man's world runs on paper and numbers, as I told you long ago. Now some of our people can speak that language." It was a small victory in the face of overwhelming defeat, but Samuel understood why it mattered. The Apache were losing their land, their freedom, their way of life. But knowledge once gained couldn't be taken away. What Dahana and Tanito had learned would stay with them, would be passed on to others, would become a tool for survival in the new world being forced upon them. The day came in the spring of 1886, when Nantan's band was moved to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona. Samuel stood on his porch and watched them pass, a long line of people on horses and on foot, carrying what little they were allowed to take. It was a funeral march for a way of life that would never return. Dahana rode past on a small pony, and when she saw Samuel, she urged her mount over to his fence. She'd grown into a young woman of 16 now, no longer the starving child who'd collapsed by his water pump. Her eyes were clear and intelligent, full of determination rather than fear. "Thank you, teacher," she said in perfect English, barely accented anymore, "for everything you taught me. I will not forget." "I know you won't," Samuel replied, his throat tight. "Use it well. Help your people." "I will," she promised. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of paper, folded carefully. "I wrote this for you, to remember." She pressed it into his hand, then rode away to rejoin her people. Samuel watched them continue on their journey, the dust rising behind them until they disappeared into the distance. Only then did he unfold the paper. It was a letter, written in Dahana's careful handwriting. The English was nearly flawless, the penmanship beautiful. She thanked him for his kindness, for seeing her as a person rather than an enemy that night she'd stumbled onto his property. She wrote about what the lessons had meant to her, how reading had opened her mind to new ideas and possibilities. She promised to use what she'd learned to help her people navigate the difficult years ahead. Samuel folded the letter carefully and took it inside. He placed it in his wife's Bible, between the pages of Proverbs where it would be safe. Then he sat in his empty cabin and allowed himself to cry for the first time in years. Not just for Dahana and her people, but for all the loss and cruelty in the world, for the way good people were crushed by forces beyond their control. The years continued to pass. Samuel grew older, his hair turning gray, his body beginning to feel the accumulated aches and pains of a hard life. He still worked his land, still survived, but the purpose that had filled his days was gone. No more students arrived on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. No more gifts appeared on his porch. The silent protection he'd enjoyed was gone with the people who'd provided it. He heard occasional news about the reservation. The conditions were harsh, the government promises mostly broken. Disease was rampant, food was scarce, and the Apache were dying slowly, ground down by poverty and despair. Samuel sent what money he could spare to missionaries working at San Carlos, asking them to make sure it reached Nantan's band. He didn't know if it ever did. Then, in the summer of 1894, something unexpected happened. Samuel was sitting on his porch one evening when he saw a rider approaching. As the figure got closer, he realized it was a young Apache man dressed in Western clothing, a suit that looked new and carefully maintained. The man dismounted at Samuel's fence and approached respectfully. "Are you Samuel Chen?" the young man asked in English. "I am," Samuel replied, curious. "My name is James. I am Apache from the San Carlos Reservation. I have a letter for you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Samuel. Samuel's hands shook as he took it. The envelope was addressed to him in handwriting he recognized immediately. Dahana's handwriting. He opened it carefully, aware that the young man was watching him. The letter was several pages long, and Samuel read it slowly, absorbing every word. Dahana wrote that she was now 24 years old and working as a teacher herself on the reservation. She'd learned to speak English fluently and had become an advocate for her people, writing letters to government officials, documenting the broken promises and harsh conditions, trying to use the system's own tools to fight for justice. She wrote about Tanito, who'd used his gift for mathematics to help Apache families understand the unfair trading practices at the reservation store, to keep records that proved they were being cheated. He'd taught others to do the same, creating a network of people who could no longer be easily fooled by dishonest traders. She wrote about her grandfather, Nantan, who had passed away peacefully the previous winter. Before his death, he'd called Dahana to his bedside and told her a story. The story of a lone man who fed a starving girl, who risked everything to teach her and to help her people. He'd told her that this act of kindness, this choice to see a human being in need rather than an enemy, had changed him. It had shown him that even in the darkest times there was still hope for understanding between peoples. Nantan had told Dahana to write to Samuel to let him know that what he'd done mattered, that the ripples from that one evening when he'd fed a starving child had spread outward in ways neither of them could have imagined. Dahana herself was now teaching 60 Apache children to read and write. Tanita was helping families fight against exploitation. Others who'd learned from them were spreading that knowledge further. The letter ended with words that made Samuel's eyes blur with tears. You saw me as a child who needed help, not as Apache or enemy or anything else, just a human being in need. That simple act of humanity saved my life that night, but it did more than that. It planted a seed of hope that has grown into something larger. I am who I am today because of what you taught me. Our people have lost almost everything, but we have not lost the ability to learn, to adapt, to fight for our survival using new tools. Thank you for everything, teacher. Thank you for showing me that kindness can exist between people who are supposed to be enemies. Thank you for believing that I was worth saving. I hope this letter finds you well and lets you know that your kindness has created a legacy that will outlive both of us. With deepest gratitude and respect, Dahana. Samuel sat on his porch holding the letter, feeling the weight of those words settle into his bones. He'd spent years thinking that his small act of kindness had been overwhelmed by larger forces, that in the grand scheme of things, feeding one starving girl hadn't mattered. But he'd been wrong.